The OBSBOT Tiny 2 is better than the Tiny 2 Lite, but if you're choosing between these two, I actually recommend the Tiny 2 Lite instead. Let's break it down. First of all, the similarities. Both of these are PTZ pan tilt zoom webcams, which means that they can be rotated horizontally and they can tilt up and down. They also can zoom. This is a digital zoom. Now, you don't actually do this with your hand. It can be controlled in the software and it can track your face. So if you're just moving around the screen, then it will follow you. And you can turn that setting on or off. You have more control over that setting in the software, and I'll show that. These both have the same frame rate and resolution, 4K 30 frames per second. That's their maximum resolution. And then they can do 1080p 60 frames per second also. And both of these are recording in the MJPEG video format. The builds are very similar, though the Tiny 2 is a little bit heavier and the Lite is positioned a little bit differently. They both come with a 60-inch USB-C to C cable and a USB-C to A adapter if you don't have an extra USB-C slot on your motherboard. Both of these also have built-in microphones if you need them. This is first the audio from the OBSBOT Tiny 2. Obviously, it's a little bit tinny, picks up a lot of background noise. That's just kind of how webcam microphones are. Switching over, this is the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite. So very similar deal with these webcam microphones. If you can avoid using them, then I would and get a studio microphone. But if you absolutely need them, they're available. Now let's get into the differences between these webcams, and it's really just the specifications which affects the image quality, because they both pretty much can do all the same things in the software and the hardware is very similar. So first is the sensor size. The OBSBOT Tiny 2 has a 1/1.5 inch sensor and the Tiny 2 Lite is 1/2 inch sensor. So Tiny 2 is significantly bigger. The aperture f1/1.9 on the Tiny 2 and 1/1.8 on the Tiny 2 Lite. I'm going to have to make these full screen so that you can really see the difference here. But this is the Tiny 2 Lite, which has a field of view of 79.4 degrees. Not too tight, not too wide, pretty much a perfect length. I think anywhere from like 78 to 86, something like that. Those are pretty good numbers so that there's not way too much in the background, especially because neither of these webcams really have much bokeh or background blur. There's just a little bit of it, but this is the Tiny 2, a little bit wider so that you can be a little bit closer if you need to be. And this has an FOV of 85.5. So yeah, the specifications and technical jargon is nice, but how do these really affect the image quality? Well, the first thing that you can notice is the sharpness. The Tiny 2's just got a little bit more sharpness. If you look at my freckles, that's really where you're going to be able to see a lot of the change in the detail. Also like the threads and stuff on my shirt, you can see a little bit more in the Tiny 2 over the Tiny 2 Lite. Also the grain, because of that larger sensor, there's a little bit less grain, that noise, that static looking effect that you're going to see. And in lower light scenarios, it's going to be more apparent, but even just right here, when I have like actually really good lighting, you can still see quite a bit of that effect in the Tiny 2 Lite if you're looking closely. But it doesn't really negatively affect the image like some other webcams with like super tiny sensors. Color accuracy is also a lot better on the Tiny 2. The Tiny 2 Lite actually does a great job when it comes to color accuracy in comparison to a lot of other webcams, but can't match the Tiny 2. So on my right, I have a blue light, and you can really see it reflected on my door in the Tiny 2. And then behind me, this is more of like an off-white just on the wall. Now you can't really see much of that blue. You can't see that like difference between the blue of the door and then also the more off-white that is on the wall in the Tiny 2 Lite. Also, my skin tone is more of just one even brown on the Tiny 2 Lite, but you get all the little gradients in the Tiny 2. So the extra level of detail and the gradients and the colors better than the Tiny 2, but the Tiny 2 Lite really holds its own. And if you didn't know exactly what to look for and I didn't label these, you might not be able to tell which one was the Tiny 2 or the Tiny 2 Lite. Which one would you expect to be more expensive than the other? And that's precisely why, if you have the option to get either of these two webcams, I'd probably get the Tiny 2 Lite because it still looks really good. Still can do 4K 30 frames per second. Also 1080 60. Let's go ahead and take a look at that right now. And here's what both of these webcams look like at 1080p 60 frames per second. A lot smoother, but they don't lose too much detail. A lot of webcams, they kind of have this compression style that makes it so that when you drop it down to 1080p and 60 frames per second, they just look really whack. These actually still look really good. All right, so this is the OBSBOT Center software. You can have this open with OBS at the same time, but you can't have the preview of the webcam at the same time OBS is open. But I can go ahead and show the preview here. So first of all, your webcams at the top, Tiny 2 and Tiny 2 Lite. If you happen to have both of them, I'm going to go ahead and click this camera. It's going to be for the Tiny 2 Lite. And now you can see this video preview here of the Tiny 2 Lite. Now here, there are a lot of cool settings that you can adjust. You can change how wide you want the field of view, or you can just kind of zoom in manually if you want to. This does have AI face tracking. I'll go ahead and show some B-roll of it on the screen right here so that you can just kind of see how it works. But also you have a lot of different other settings that you can adjust. So the standard motion, normal tracking, all this stuff, you can have it track different parts of your body basically, or you can turn that off entirely. So normally there is a command. If you hold your hand up like this, then it will start tracking your face, or it will stop tracking your face. The light is green right now and it will flash a different color. So what you could do over in the more tab is you can change these gesture controls, or not change them, but you can turn them on or off. Now, if I put this up, now it's going to start tracking my face. So if I start moving around, then yeah, I actually prefer the dynamic zoom a little bit more. This will make it so that you can zoom in or zoom out. It's a really cool effect. Also, if you have this on, you can go over to console and then you can move the zoom back to how you want it to be. You have the autofocus. Oh, let me demonstrate the autofocus of these webcams really quickly, actually. So first off, this is with the Tiny 2. Not the fastest autofocus, the Tiny 2 Lite. Bit snappier on there. So I do think a little bit of improvement actually has been made to the autofocus. Now, anyway, going back over to the Tiny 2, all the basic settings that you'd want to control in a webcam, like the shutter speed and the ISO, I have these all set manually. They look as good as I can really get them with the amount of light that I'm using. You can set the color temperature exactly. Love all these settings that you can control in here. This is for the gimbal, which can let you move this webcam to get the precise angle that you want. One thing that this webcam can't quite do is it can't really like move like diagonally, and it can't auto level itself. So my like desk is very slightly off level just because of the way that it is. Something happened with it, and I can't make this like actually auto level itself, like, so it's not like a gimbal like that. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you can actually do a lot more. You can't actually do this with an AMD graphics card, so do keep that in mind. You can still add the bokeh effect, you just can't do it in the advanced tab with the blur effect. So this can change the blur level. I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and that's actually a pretty cool effect. It's something that I've never liked, artificial bokeh and background stuff like that. It just has never been my thing, because you can see a lot of weird artifacts. Like you look at my hair, anything that's like kind of blending a little bit back into the background, anything that's like, so like my face, that's obviously in the foreground, but something like my microphone, right, or the back of my head, my hair, stuff like that, those are all things that start to kind of get warped. I find that the Tiny 2 Lite is a better value. Way cheaper, but you can barely tell the difference unless you know exactly what to look for. Again, it's not that the Tiny 2 is bad. It's an amazing webcam. I'd say it's probably the second best webcam on the market besides the Kyo Pro Ultra. It's just that the Tiny 2 Lite is such a great value. Amazing job, OBSBOT. Again, I've tagged both of these webcams and they're linked below.